Hello, everybody. Hi. Well, this is great. It's very rewarding to see so many of you here. So welcome. My name is Katarina Dutjanovais, by the way. I'm a professor of philosophy at the philosophy faculty, and I organize this annual series of lectures called the Aspasia lectures. And the idea of the lectures are to promote and celebrate the work of women in philosophy, but in academia, generally speaking, too. And today, our guest is Lloyd. This is, by the way, the second Aspasia lecture. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce you, Professor Elisabeth Lloyd, who currently holds the Arnold and Maxine Tennis Chair of History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. And for those of you who don't know, if you have a chair that's named after a person, you made it. That's like the really fancy chairs. Yeah. Before she went to Bloomington, she spent many years in California, in San Diego and in Berkeley. And before that, when she was a graduate student, she did graduate work at Harvard working with the legendary Stephen Jay Gould, who I think she'll talk about at some point or another today. Legendary, but also polemic. For those of you coming from biology, are there biology students here? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about, right? I'm a fan, by the way. So she worked at Harvard and then Princeton, where she obtained her PhD under the supervision of Bas van Frassen, a very distinguished philosopher of science. She has authored a very large number of articles and also quite a few books. Professor Lloyd has done groundbreaking work on a number of areas in philosophy of science, in particular philosophy of biology, the role of models in science, and gender issues in science. However, it is her work on the science of female orgasm which catapulted her from brilliant but little known outside academia philosophy professor to a worldwide celebrity. Her book, The Case of the Female Orgasm, made a huge splash when it was released in 2005. Just Google it and you'll see. And it attracted much praise, but also much rage from some evolutionary biologists as well as from many feminists. And I think Lisa will talk a little bit about this today, about why feminists were so angered by her book. To me, this book is one of the best, if not the very best, examples of a philosopher actually making a difference in scientific debates as well as among the public. It is the proof that philosophers do not only talk about esoteric things that have no bearing in real-life problems and situations. And also let me note that Professor Lloyd's recent work on the science of climate change, which she will talk about tomorrow at the Faculty of Philosophy, we have a smaller colloquium, but everybody's welcome if you want to show up. So her work on climate change is, of course, equally relevant for a very big real-life problem. And on that, by the way, she just told me over dinner that 5 days ago she heard that she has been nominated as affiliated scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the US. And that's pretty, it's really something if you're a philosopher and you're nominated as an affiliated scientist. For all these reasons, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to welcome Professor Lloyd here in Groningen today, and I'm sure we all very much look forward to her lecture, so let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a lovely honor to be here today and to speak in the Aspasia series. I'm extremely happy to be chosen for such a role, and I hope you will enjoy tonight's lecture. It is a bit racier than the typical philosophy lecture, but you are allowed to giggle and to laugh. Much of what you will hear today is new since my book came out, and so it will bring you up to date, and I will present exhibits of how two biases, one social and one theoretical, can lead science badly astray. So let's begin our journey through female orgasm and its evolutionary explanations. Here's the order of presentation. We start with the obvious account, move on to the pair bond and byproduct / bonus account, and conclude by examining the hottest account today, the female choice account. I think that almost none of these accounts pass minimal scientific scrutiny, although they have led the field for 58 years. When we think about female orgasm, at first it seems perfectly obvious that the trait is an evolutionary adaptation. Women who have orgasms will want to have more intercourse, and more intercourse obviously usually leads to more babies, all things being equal. Thus, female orgasm seems to be an adaptation evolved through natural selection, where those with the most orgasms would leave the most babies, which explains why it spread in the human population. Unfortunately, the basic premise of this explanation is not true. Women who have more orgasms do not have more intercourse. It might be that women who experience more sexual excitement have more intercourse, but sexual excitement is not the same thing as orgasm, as any woman can tell you. More importantly, women who have more orgasms also do not have more babies. In fact, there is no genetic association between the ability to have for women to have orgasms and their success in leaving offspring. And so there's no known tie between evolutionary fitness and female orgasm. So the simple and obvious explanation simply and obviously conflicts with the evidence. But the evolution of female orgasm is an important puzzle to work out with real consequences. For instance, an evolutionary account of female orgasm is used to underpin a notion of the normal function of female orgasm. More specifically, an evolutionary notion of normal function is used for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Psychiatric Profession, the DSM-4 and 5. How many of you have heard of this? Yeah, good. By which sexual disorders are diagnosed. So they decide who gets diagnosed with a sexual disorder. And the business of deciding whether or not women are normal or not is based on their orgasmic performance according to some evolutionary adaptationist accounts. And arguably that's been very destructive since it's held them to an unreasonable standard, which we'll discuss later on. But in evolutionary science, there is no single accepted evolutionary account of female orgasm, and thus no notion of its normal function, if it has any at all. In my 2005 book, I examined 21 evolutionary explanations for female orgasm, and 11 of these explanations are based on the notion that a male-female pair bond is adaptive. That is, it contributes to getting genes into the future generations, and that female orgasm helps with pair bonding. A pair bond is an attachment, usually monogamous, between a particular man and woman. The pair bond is supposed to be adaptive for several reasons, especially in that it helps with the raising of the very dependent human infants. Quote, the vast bulk of copulation in our species is obviously concerned not with producing offspring, but with cementing the pair bond by providing mutual rewards for the sexual partners, end quote. The quote's from Desmond Morris, one of the leading pair bond theorists. His work was very influential on other scientists who adopted some version or variant of his pair bond view. More specifically, the female orgasm is an adaptation to reward the female to participate in frequent intercourse, which itself is an adaptation to reward the male to stay in the pair bond, which is the main adaptation, to help raise the offspring together and have the male provide protection and food to the mother and offspring. We can think of these relations between traits being represented in the first three traits of this evolutionary model of the adaptive pair bond. You can see this here in this selection model, which includes the trait under selection. I wonder if I can get my mouse to do this. Oh, yes, I don't have a laser pointer. Does anybody have a laser pointer? Okay, never mind. Can you see the mouse if I do it? Okay. You can see this here in the selection model, which includes the trait under selection here, as well as the trait's connection to fitness here, and the selection pressure on the trait affecting her. The year before Morris published his book in 1967, a major event occurred in sexology. the publication of William Masters and Virginia Johnson's book, Human Sexual Response. How many people here have heard of Masters and Johnson? Not very many. All right, well, I'll tell you about them. They were legendary American sex researchers, and they outlined a pattern of sexual excitement and orgasm exhibited by both men and women. Their model emphasized the indirect stimulation of the clitoris that occurred during penetration and intercourse, which on their picture led always to orgasm. But there's a problem with this, as some of you may know. I see that you do know this. Good. So let's review some basic dynamics of human sexual response and human orgasm. When do female orgasms occur? Many of women's orgasms are achieved through masturbation, as Kinsey and his colleagues famously indicated in 1953, to the embarrassment of almost everybody. The most striking thing about female masturbation is how likely it is to produce orgasm. In 1953, Kinsey and his colleagues found that almost 2/3 of their sample of nearly 6,000 women had masturbated, and among those, only 4% did not have orgasm with masturbation. Similarly, Haidt found that 82% of her sample of about 3,000 women said that they masturbated, and only 4% of those women did not have masturbation that way either, while 95% of these women, quote, could orgasm easily and readily whenever they wanted. The standard methods of female masturbation are also of great interest to me, in a scholarly way. Paul Gebhardt, one of Kinsey's co-authors, notes that the most common masturbation technique is the manual stimulation of the clitoris and the small lips of the vulva, which accounts for 84% of all acts of masturbation among the women that Kinsey surveyed. Again, that was over 8,000 women. Less than 1/5 of women masturbate by inserting an object or fingers into the vagina. Nearly all of those who do so accompany the motion with simultaneous clitoral stimulation. Similarly, Haidt found that only 1.5% of women masturbate by vaginal insertion alone, numbers that were consistent with Kinsey and Gebhardt's findings. As Kinsey himself noted, women almost never masturbate solely in imitation of the act of intercourse, by inserting something into the vagina without also simultaneously stimulating the clitoris. Some female orgasms also occur during heterosexual intercourse, but they are more problematic. In my research, I've summarized 32 studies spanning 74 years on the rate of female orgasm with intercourse. My investigation results were nearly identical with those of a recent study of 3,000 women by some geneticist, Kaitam Daywood, which we can see on this slide. This almost flat curve is represented by an x-axis of overall orgasmic performance here, and while the y-axis represents the frequency in the population. By the way, the reason this graph is a graph of orgasm with intercourse and not plain orgasm is that all evolutionary explanations in investigations and nearly all sexology studies of women's orgasm, with the exceptions of the ones that I just noted, involve only orgasm with intercourse. This obvious heterosexism has passed unremarked by all researchers as well. Note that only about 13% of women always have orgasm from intercourse, and by the way, about half of these women do so by accompanying intercourse with direct stimulation of the clitoris by hand. either theirs or their partner's or by vibrator. This is called assisted intercourse. In contrast, roughly a third of women on this, just taking it back, on this end of the graph, everybody down here either rarely or never have orgasm with intercourse. 5 to 10% of women never have orgasm at all, from any means, ever, according to numerous studies. The rest fall in between. Sometimes do, sometimes don't. That's this group in here. Before we go on, let's reflect on something about Hollywood movies. And also most pornos, for that matter. But I'm going to focus on the mainstream Hollywood films that get distributed around the world that you might see. When Hollywood presents women having sex in movies, for example, think about this for a minute, they easily and always have orgasm from intercourse with no manual assistance. True? Yeah. In real life, this represents between 6 and 10% of women. So that is about 6 to 10% of women actually respond with orgasm to that kind of unassisted intercourse. So the other 90 to 94% of women, and that's really almost everybody here, it goes from here to here, are not accurately represented in any Hollywood films, ever, year after year after year after year after year. So those images of women's sexuality misinform both men's and women's expectations for what should happen when they have intercourse. The men think it should happen, what's wrong with him? The women think it should happen, what's wrong with her? And this has led to much disappointment, heartache, and confusion on both sides. I call the overall gap between the participation of women in intercourse and their frequency of orgasm in intercourse, the orgasm-intercourse discrepancy. If we look back at masturbation, though, we get a very different picture of a more easily and quickly orgasmic women. Remember the ones who can orgasm easily whenever they felt like it? The contrast between these two portraits, right, of female sexuality led many sex researchers, most prominently Kinsey, to conclude that intercourse often does not provide the right kind of sustained stimulation of the clitoral area to induce female orgasm. These are the key features of female sexuality necessary to evaluate evolutionary accounts today. So, going back, it's clear from the pair bond theorists' frequent intercourse theory that they're using that Masters and Johnson's model of the indirect clitoral stimulation caused by thrusting during intercourse. It's pretty indirect. In other words, the clitoris is stimulated primarily by friction against its own hood. But Masters and Johnson developed this model by observing the women in their study very closely. These women were selected for their study only if they could consistently and easily have orgasms during intercourse. And we know that Masters and Johnson's women were not typical of women in general, and in fact represent only about 6 to 10% of the female population again. This is a problem for Morris and all of the other pair bond theorists, because it's hard to use a trait possessed only by 6 to 10% of the population to tell an evolutionary story, although we will discuss one later on. But Morris and the other pair bond theorists never addressed this problem. Now let's briefly review the basics of evolutionary explanations about adaptations in general. Take the giant anteater. This is an animal belonging to the order of mammals that includes armadillos and sloths, but they all descended from an animal much like an armadillo, minus the armor. Anteaters have since evolved special traits. For example, their 25-inch, that's 63 centimeters long tongue, and special giant salivary glands, which produce sticky saliva that enhance their survival and reproduction. Ancestors who tended to have longer, stickier tongues could successfully eat more ants from a nest than those with shorter, less sticky tongues. They just couldn't reach down there. Thus, they had higher reproductive success rates. Over evolutionary time, these traits became very special and exaggerated, leaving us with the giant anteaters that we have today. Thus, we start with variation in the crucial traits of tongue length and stickiness, and because there was a reproductive advantage associated with those traits, which we see in the connection to fitness in the model, that these long sticky tongues get more ants, we have the anteater's specialized adaptations. This is how a basic explanation by natural selection works. So let's try to picture this process. In the ancestral population, we have here the frequencies of the different tongue lengths of anteaters, all the way from the very short-tongued anteaters to the very long-tongued anteaters up here. And you can see there's a lot of variety in the population. This is the frequency in the population up here on this axis. Now we turn to what the population looks like after selection has acted over many, many generations on the tongues and saliva of the anteaters. As you can see here, there are hardly any short-tongued anteaters left, hardly any medium-tongued anteaters in the population. Rather, all or almost all the anteater tongues are extremely long. This is because selection has produced a peak. This adaptive, it's called an adaptive peak in the population, a peak in the distribution of anteaters around this very long length. Now compare this graph to our graph of the trait of orgasm with intercourse among women. It doesn't have any big peaks in it, the way that regular directional or balancing natural selection and most sexual selection produces. Simple selection forces produce peaks in the distribution curves of a trait. As more and more of the organisms in the population are selected to have the desirable form of the trait somewhere in the trait variation. If there is no selection acting on a particular trait, we expect to see exactly what we get in the female orgasm case, a fairly flat distribution across all possible forms of the trait, from highly orgasmic to not orgasmic at all. And remember, 1 in either 10 or anywhere from 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 women never, ever have orgasm in their lives. So you have to take account of that aspect of the variation. One proposed theory involves a form of sexual selection that may produce increased variability in the trait like this, and I'll comment on it later. The fact that women vary so widely in their trait performance, orgasmic performance, provides very suggestive evidence that all but one of the selection explanations offered so far for female orgasm, no matter what its details are, is false. It's wrong, right? Because each one of these explanations offered so far, except one, predicts a peak in this curve, like the anteater curve. But as you can see, there are no peaks. Hence, nearly every one of the selective and adaptive explanations for female orgasm is undermined by the data from sexology. And as we saw before, the available pair bond accounts are prima facie not compatible with the sex research regarding female orgasm. But you might be thinking, surely this problem with the orgasm intercourse discrepancy isn't really fatal. Isn't it enough that women have orgasm sometime during the sexual encounter for female orgasm to be selected? Then orgasm would still count as an adaptation that supported the pair bond. In other words, it didn't necessarily need to happen during intercourse. But I'm afraid this hypothesis is in trouble based on what we know today anyway. William Davenport, in his study of sexual practices from 114 cultures from around the globe, including hunter-gatherer, agricultural, and so forth, concluded the following. In most societies for which there are data, it is reported that men take the initiative and without extended foreplay, proceed vigorously towards climax without much regard for achieving synchrony with a woman's orgasm. Again and again, there are reports that coitus is primarily completed in terms of the man's passions and pleasures, with scant attention paid to the women's response. Kinsey and his colleagues came to a similar sad conclusion about American sexual practices in the mid-20th century, and the recent cross-cultural study of Lauman et al. Seems to confirm this same trend within the last decade. Thus, there seems to be little opportunity for female orgasm to occur at any point during a given sexual encounter, much less for it to be selected. A further problem with the pair bond account, which assumes that women engage in sex for the reward of orgasm, is that women who are more orgasmic do not in fact have more desire to have sex. They do not have higher libidos. And women who do not have orgasms do not have lower libidos. There is no correlation between how orgasmic a woman is and her having or being interested in having intercourse. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but it was first established by Kinsey and his colleagues and has been confirmed by a recent study of nearly 3,000 women. My conclusion from the set of 11 pair bond accounts of female orgasm is that there is a male-centered bias operating. But what does that mean? Male-centered bias involves looking at things from an exclusively male point of view and consequently usually unconsciously, in fact almost always unconsciously, neglecting a distinct treatment of a female point of view. The result is that in these scenarios, an autonomous or distinctly different female sexuality, which emerges so clearly from the sex research, is mysteriously ignored. Throughout these explanations, female response to intercourse is assumed to be identical to male response to intercourse. Kinsey established that male's response to intercourse is almost always orgasm. And in these pair bond explanations, female response to intercourse is assumed to be identical, that is orgasm, universal unproblematic orgasm for the females as a reward for intercourse as they describe it. What's perhaps the most odd is that several of these pair bond accounts actually cite the sex research containing the crucial information that undermines their own account. It seems that these authors did not actually use or read the sexology references they cited, but rather employed common and mistaken popular unscientific understandings of female sexuality in their scientific accounts of the trait. One related prominent product of the early adaptationist pair bond accounts of female orgasm in the 1960s and 70s was a normative pattern of orgasm as the only proper result of heterosexual intercourse. It had been assumed since Freud wrote in the early 20th century that women's orgasm was an adaptation, evolutionarily designed as a response to heterosexual intercourse. And so these women who did not have orgasm with intercourse were clearly not functioning properly or normally. Freudianism said female erotic pleasure is initially centered on the clitoris in infancy and childhood. I mean, he did know that much. But with the process of maturation into womanhood, the core of female eroticism on his theory must migrate to the vagina as the healthy woman's primary erotic center. Women who failed to enact this migration, that is the 90 to 94% of women who remained dependent on the clitoris for orgasm or who failed to have orgasm from intercourse without additional clitoral stimulation, were labeled infantile, immature, neurotic, frigid, dysfunctional. So there you have it. Each of these labels is an assault on women's well-being itself. It's very significant that this labeling was not restricted to some medicalized or head-shrunken subset of the population. It was the coin of the realm. When Desmond Morris and most pair bond theorists were writing, sex researchers Masters and Johnson also normatively portrayed heterosexual intercourse as naturally and normally culminating in orgasm for both men and women on a reliable basis. Those who didn't were labeled by them as dysfunctional. But it's important to remember that they actively imposed this picture on their data by only employing women in their experience who always had orgasm with no hands intercourse, thus radically biasing their portrait of female orgasm. You put something in, you get the same thing out. People routinely derived social norms from biological findings, even if the scientists and philosophers always disapprove of these conclusions. In this light, then, it's important to think about the message that will be sent by a given evolutionary theory. The Masters and Johnson picture of normal heterosexual sex was taken up in Morris's and other pair bond evolutionary accounts. Thus, I conclude that a healthy half of adaptive explanations of female orgasm are biased, specifically from the male-centered neglect of very well-documented sexual differences among males and females. The result is deeply and totally incompatible with the empirical evidence concerning the topic of investigation, human female orgasm. That is, Masters, Johnson, and nearly all other sex researchers and nearly all the evolutionists through several decades took the pair bond theory of orgasm and claimed that all those women who did not fit the intercourse equals easy and reliable orgasm picture were abnormal, even though the evidence showed they were in the very, very, very large majority. In other words, this is the way that they did not face the fact that their theory was empirically incorrect or false. They simply defined women who did not fit their theory as abnormal, right? Even though this left 90 to 94% of women as abnormal. But at least their theory was right. So summing up the situation with regard to the pair bond accounts, here's a slide showing the status of the evidence supporting such accounts. As you can see, the only aspect of this model that's well supported is that orgasms have a genetic basis, an assumption shared with all the models. And it's well supported, and we would expect it in order to tell an evolutionary story. So this looks not so good for the pair bond account. An alternative, non-adaptive evolutionary explanation for female orgasm was first proposed by anthropologist Donald Simons in 1979. Consider the problem of why males have nipples. I know you have done this. Nipples clearly provide a reproductive advantage to female mammals, and in that they ensure reproductive success by providing the means to feed the offspring for females. But there's no known contribution to fitness to the males. The evolutionary explanation for the existence of male nipples is based on the development of the embryo and the facts that nipples are adaptations in females. Males and females share the same embryological form at the beginnings of life. They start off with the same basic body plan, and only if the male embryos receive a jolt of hormones during the 8th week of pregnancy do the sexually distinguishing characteristics appear. Similarly, in males, orgasms are adaptations. They were actively selected for, but the females get them for free. This sort of explanation is called developmental or non-adaptive. Female orgasm is technically seen as a byproduct or a bonus of selection on male orgasm. Here you see the early embryo's genital tubercle, which is in the green, which turns into the penis in the male and the clitoris in the female. Okay, here we go. Female, male, penis, clitoris. You get the idea, right? Okay, it's shocking when you first see it, really. These organs with common embryological origins are called homologs. So the tissues involved in orgasm for males and females are also homologs. They involve nerve tissues and erectile tissues and muscle fibers. Here for the male, all shared in the female. So the females get the functioning orgasmic tissues through this embryological connection here, and are often capable of having orgasms under the right conditions of rhythmic stimulation. There's a variety of evidence supporting this byproduct account of female orgasm, and I argued in my book that Simon's hypothesis had better evolutionary support than any other available hypothesis today. Nevertheless, Simon's theory has encountered a great deal of resistance. Part of this is surely the technical name of the trait as an evolutionary byproduct. Several feminist critics have found this belittling and dismissive, noting that it sounds like something being compared to cheap sausage. So I've renamed it the bonus, or better, fantastic bonus account, which is much more accurate after all. And Simon's account accords very well with the data about human sexuality. Strikingly, females masturbate through direct stimulation of the clitoris, the homologous organ to the penis, and not through simulating intercourse, as we talked about at the beginning, just as we would expect on the byproduct account. Similar stimulation to homologs, that is the same organs, that's the penis in men and the clitoris in women, yields orgasm for both sexes. It also explains the low rate of reliable female orgasms with intercourse. The reasons these orgasms are so infrequent is the straightforward lack of the appropriate necessary rhythmic stimulation to the homologous organ to the penis, the clitoris, as Kinsey said. Thus, women's orgasm with intercourse would not be considered to have an evolutionary function at all. And women who did not reliably have orgasm with intercourse, that is the majority of women, and even including women who didn't have orgasm at all by any means, would all be considered medically and biologically normal. Simon's thesis is also supported by the non-human primate evidence. Female stump-tail macaques have been shown to have orgasms by hardwiring them up, which shows that they have the distinctive contractions and other bodily markers characteristic of orgasm. There's a fascinating thing about these orgasms, though. Most of them occur when one female climbs on top of the back of another female and rubs her clitoris against the other one's back, thus providing the necessary rhythmic stimulation desired for orgasm. A few of these same females also have orgasms while copulating with males, but these rates tend to be quite low. In addition, none of the observations about homosexual orgasms were observed to occur during the monkey's fertile periods, thus denying any account based on hormones, or estrus, or hormonal urges, or surges, or whatever you want like that. All of this is bad news for evolutionary theorists attempting to tell adaptive stories of female orgasm that tie it to heterosexual copulation or to fertility. But it is completely compatible with Simon's byproduct account. Note that the bonus byproduct account does not deny that the clitoris, as an organ of sensation, has a crucial evolutionary function. On the byproduct account, the clitoris almost certainly has been selected because it aids the female in sexual excitement and induces and prepares her to seek out and have intercourse. But this reasoning does not extend to the use of these same tissues for female orgasm. Orgasm is a special reflex that sometimes results from clitoral and genital excitement. General sexual excitement and the special reflex of orgasm are easily distinguished by most women, and just as easily distinguished by natural selection. Finally, the disconnect between female orgasm and a multitude of traits that might indicate that orgasm is an adaptation was demonstrated powerfully in a recent study by Brendan Zeech and his colleagues. They examined correlations of such potentially adaptive traits and orgasmic activity in a population of nearly 3,000 women, finding 0 to very weak correlations across all 19 traits that they examined, including libido, social class, orientation toward uncommitted sex, restricted attitudes towards sex, marital status, age of first intercourse, and lifetime number of sex partners, among others. None of the correlations had significant genetic components, thus undercutting any ascription of a fitness benefit to orgasm. And finally, the same authors published a new study of over 8,000 women this year that shows that there is 0 correlation between straightforward reproductive success and any genetic aspect of orgasm in women. There's never been any evidence linking orgasm to fitness. And these new studies echo this crucial lack in the evolutionary stories that are told. So here's the current state of the evidence for the fantastic bonus account. To review, when comparing the evidence for the adaptive versus the bonus explanations, a huge problem has been the general tendency on the part of evolutionists to favor evolutionary explanations that attribute functions to every trait, otherwise known as adaptationism. In general, adaptationism is simply the legitimate research program in evolutionary science oriented towards discovering and investigating the functions and limitations of traits. They use the research question, what is the function of this trait? Well, the possible answers to this question range among the function of this trait is A, the function of this trait is B, and so on. But if such a question is insisted on as the only legitimate question and answer to any trait, then trouble arises. Suppose that female orgasm does not have its own separate function, that it is not a distinctive adaptation, but rather a bonus to a male adaptation. Then this answer fails to respond to the adaptationist research question. It is non-responsive. We can easily use a more encompassing evolutionary and Darwinian method, which I call the evolutionary factors approach, under which we can ask a variety of questions, including the adaptationist question. So the formal question is, what evolutionary factors account for the form and distribution of this trait? And the possible answers range from adaptations to byproducts to phyletic holdovers, as you can see here. The first one is an answer that says that it's an adaptation. The second says it's a byproduct or linked to an adaptation. Third says it's a phyletic holdover, a remnant, or a constraint. Note that this may involve asking about the function of a trait as the first answer, but if the trait fails to answer one question, it can be answered using another. As you can see, viewing the byproduct bonus view in solely the adaptationist functional way may be a mistake, because not all traits have functions. In fact, in the case of female orgasm, some evolutionists won't take no for an answer and cannot weigh the evidence in favor of an alternative causal account. But the adaptationist scientists are not the only ones who really do not like the bonus account. For example, Columnist Cherry Potter wrote in The Guardian that should the byproduct bonus view be accepted and certain assumptions taken, quote, this would be a tragedy for women and risk returning to the sexual dark ages when so many thought sex was something men enjoyed and women endured. Other feminist journalists have characterized the fantastic bonus account as propaganda designed to promote the view that women don't need to orgasm and that women's orgasms are not as important as males. Another wrote that feminists understandably don't like the idea of their sexuality being reduced to a mere Adam's rib byproduct. Another said the account is like saying female orgasms are, this is my favorite one, frivolous. Well, aren't they a little frivolous? But, okay, like all female things. All of this involves a rather large mistake. Let's start with the fact that it's clear that evolution doesn't dictate what's culturally important. The capacities to read, write, play the violin, sing opera, operate a computer, read a book, all are enormously important traits in our culture, but none of them are evolutionary adaptations. They're all byproducts. They're all bonuses. Yet it's intimated over and over again here that female orgasm is elevated and legitimated by having an evolutionary function. As I point out in the book, feminists who claim that the bonus account belittles, quote, or, quote, diminishes female orgasm simply in virtue of its evolutionary origin are succumbing to the archest of arch adaptationism. We've just noted that we don't think reading needs to be an adaptation in order to be socially significant. So why should we make an exception for female orgasm? Besides, evolutionary research program of adaptationism has absolutely nothing to recommend it to feminists. Freudianism provides a great example for us. Freud believed that all women ought to have orgasm from so-called vaginal intercourse. This belief was explicitly derived from his conviction that female orgasm must be an evolutionary adaptation to promote reproduction. Because he was convinced that selection was operating on female orgasm, it must occur related to reproductive sex, that is, intercourse. Thus, sexual responsiveness must migrate from the clitoris to the vagina to cause so-called vaginal orgasms from unassisted intercourse. Masters and Johnson told us in 1965, even as they emphasized intercourse, that women have only one basic source of orgasmic stimulation, the clitoris, and that Freud's oppressive standard, the vaginal orgasm, required to prove that a woman was mature and healthy, was a myth. We now think there are up to 5 neuronal sources for orgasmic stimuli, but the clitoris is still deemed the major source by most, and their point still stands. But evolutionary adaptationists have continued to be the enemies of female satisfaction and autonomy since Freud. I've mentioned today how an adaptationist emphasis on the evolutionary function in the pair bond theories led scientists to neglect and contradict the real evidence on female orgasm, to engage in male bias science, and to perpetuate repressive standards of female sexual response. There's no way in which my discussion about bonuses or byproducts undermined women's righteous claims on orgasms. But adaptationist evolutionary theory, with its coveted endowment of usefulness, has virtually always, in fact, been utilized in androcentric ways. In the past 2 decades, those pursuing an adaptive account of female orgasm have frequently relied on some version of a female choice theory of the trait. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, but some not, but let me just give you the overview. The basic idea is that the female will mate with more than one male over a short period of time or over different mating periods. The theory then says that the females will have orgasm preferentially with the higher quality males. This is not supposed to happen consciously in any way, but rather unconsciously in reaction to some key features of the male. Some of them say it's his aggressiveness or assertiveness or masculinity or something. Thus, the woman will instinctually, yes, have orgasm with the higher quality males, and no, not have orgasm with lower quality males. The next assumption is that the orgasm is accompanied by the unhappily titled mechanism of uterine upsuck. That makes it more likely that the female will be fertilized by the higher quality male, thus leading to higher fitness for her through fitter and more and fitter offspring. So I want to emphasize something here. The key to this claimed female choice selective mechanism is that the orgasmic women are required to respond to orgasms only sometimes with intercourse, so that uterine upsuck and therefore fertilization happens preferentially, yes, with the high quality males, no with the low quality males. So here's the selection model. This type of female choice selection scenario can theoretically produce a flat curve of trait variation like the one we see for intercourse, and it's the only one. However, as the population genetics modeling the case emphasized, the flat curve is only produced by the female selection model if the selection pressure is strong, as you see right here. So next, here is the picture. Yeah, a little slow. Here is the picture of the state of the empirical evidence for the female choice selection model. You can see that the model fails miserably according to the evidence that we have today. Let's go over this in a bit of detail because this is the most widely believed and widely taught explanation for female orgasm out there today. It's very, very important to note here that two essential features of this explanation have key evidence against them. Under this theory, female orgasm is accompanied by a sucking motion of the uterus. This uterine or sperm upsuck theory is an old piece of folk wisdom dating back to the ancient Greeks, but it has never enjoyed any real evidential support, although people have been seeking scientific evidence to support it for over 65 years. There's actually evidence against it from a nicely designed set of experiments done by Masters and Johnson in the 1960s. Nevertheless, the upsuck hypothesis is very widely believed by lay people, especially due to a deceptive narration of a video shown on TV that some of you may have seen, and had achieved widespread acceptance among scientists since the 1990s through the work of Robin Baker and Mark Bellis, published in 1993, which claimed to provide empirical evidence supporting the phenomenon. But look at their data. In one data set, they have 1 out of 11 couples in the sample contributing 93 out of the 127 data points. Nearly 3/4 of the data were contributed by one person, that means. Okay, 4 of the other 10 couples contributed 1 data point each. That's 3% of the data out of 11 couples. So extrapolating to the population at large, based primarily on the results of a single subject, badly violates standard statistical practice. That's putting it mildly. Some of you may know that mathematicians and statisticians have a technical use for the word garbage. But many dozens and even hundreds of adaptationists nevertheless use this paper. And in the end, the Baker and Bellis data are statistically worthless and no scientific conclusions can be drawn from them. Nevertheless, many dozens and even hundreds of adaptationists use this paper to support their conclusion that female orgasm was an adaptation in talks, in class, and in print. So why was this account accepted by so many of the top researchers in human evolution and taught in human evolution courses by evolutionary psychologists and sociobiologists and evolutionists? It cannot be because the paper was good science, because it clearly wasn't, as even my harshest critics now agree. It seems to be because they just liked what the paper had to say, namely that female orgasm serves an evolutionary function. Here was the answer to their question. Here we see adaptationist bias in action, favoring adaptive functional accounts over the non-adaptive accounts without good evidence for doing so, or indeed against the evidence. And some adaptationists, such as David Putz and Kaitam Daywood, are still citing this Baker and Bella's paper, despite their having given no real defense of the paper against the critique I just gave, among other critiques. Putz and his colleagues need the upsuck theory in their female choice models, so they assume it's true, despite the unanswered published criticisms. Many human evolutionists and evolutionary psychologists also like that this model cast women's sexuality as functional and served a reproductive purpose, tying women's lives to reproduction and not allowing a separate or autonomous female sexuality. Function equals value, and a valuable woman's trait is a functional one. You can see clearly another case of androcentric reasoning in action here, as women are reduced to their reproductive roles, and autonomous sexuality separate from their reproductive roles is denied to exist or flourish. Such a bias produces blindness to the facts of the matter, as it did and continues to do in this case. More specifically, liking or needing the outcome of a paper is not really considered a good reason to treat it as a fact. Again, the fact that this paper is so widely and uncritically accepted, and for so long, over a decade, demonstrates an adaptive bias, because the researchers favored a functional view of the female orgasm. They ended up, through both androcentric and adaptationist biases, viewing the evidential situation completely backwards. They saw the functional upsuck account as very well confirmed, even though it was not. Are we waiting for that to come in? And take another look at that evidence. And then they rejected the actually very well confirmed bonus byproduct account altogether. Really, one of the most compelling things about the female choice theory is that it gives an answer to the question of why do women respond to intercourse the way they do. More commonly not with orgasm, which was mysterious under other adaptive theories. It gives us an answer. We want an answer. But we are not without the means to discover more facts. I often act as an outside critic to biology or sexology because I have studied the logical structure of evolutionary theory and its explanations. So I act as a source of methodological criticism. But in this case, I also became an insider, an empirical researcher, by co-authoring several papers with a neurophysiologist from Emory University, Kim Wallen. He and I began by surveying women about their means of having orgasms with their partners, and in addition published new analyses of data that bear directly on whether or not women have orgasm with intercourse and when, and which goes to this issue. Oops. Oopsie. This paper reflects on the feasibility and plausibility of the key mechanism at stake in the female choice hypothesis, the preferential mating of women with higher quality males. In brief, Wallen and I published a study in 2011 in Hormones and Behavior, offering an anatomical, non-adaptive explanation of why women have a variety of orgasm rates, one that does not rest at all on male qualities, attractiveness, masculinity, or other socially coded traits, used to show high quality of males in those female choice models. Here are some of our data. going to have to do this right. The white bars here represent women who have orgasm with intercourse on a reliable basis, while the black bars represent women who do not routinely have orgasm with intercourse. On the y-axis is the CUMD. Now, I didn't notice the problem with this name until too late, but it actually stands for clitoral urinary meatus distance, or the distance between the clitoris and the urinary meatus, or the urinary opening. It's meant to stand in as a proxy for the vaginal opening. Now, you can see from this chart that women who routinely have orgasms that are in the white bar have much shorter CUMD measurements than women who do not have orgasms with intercourse, usually. The difference between the two groups is highly significant. It's more than 2 standard deviations, for those of you who like statistics. In both groups that we showed, this is one set of data and this is another set of data here. The 2 data groups are combined. We also found this distance was strongly predictive. So the distance is strongly predictive of whether or not the woman has an orgasm with intercourse. You can see that it is irrelevant to the rate of orgasm with masturbation, as it should be, if we're right about this. So, in other words, we found that an anatomical trait, this distance between the clitoris and a structure near the vagina, strongly predicted whether or not a woman would have orgasm with intercourse. This makes good sense if you think about it. If you would like a copy of the paper, I can just shoot me an email, I can send you a copy. Thus, Wallen and I found that for the strong majority of women in our sample's anatomy seemed to suggest destiny. Clearly, if her anatomy so strongly influences whether or not she has an orgasm with intercourse with male, that leaves little room for the genetic quality of the male, specifically his masculinity, attractiveness, or dominance, as presented in the female choice theories, to influence the outcome of such intercourse. According to the theorists, the selection pressure of this type of sexual selection needs to be strong in order to produce any result in terms of evolution. Thus, the anatomical relation we discovered makes such a scenario nearly completely unfeasible. So before the female choice theory was desired to explain the orgasm intercourse discrepancy and the wide variation in women's orgasm rates that we find in the flat curve. But we find the force of selection in that theory is insufficient to explain the differences that we do have in orgasmic frequencies, and the anatomical differences are likely to be caused by differential exposure to androgens in the womb, based on studies in other mammals. The genital tubercle that we saw before rotates further forward or towards the front of the body and away from the anus and vagina as this fetus is exposed to more and more androgens. And this is true for both males and females. A measurement of the anogenital distance, called the AGD, which is analogous to CUMD, is found experimentally in other animals to vary with prenatal androgen exposure. Now let me tell you a real curious question raised by these facts. It was recently discovered that this very distance, the AGD, the anogenital distance, developmentally correlated to CUMD, is strongly correlated to fitness in men. Specifically, the smaller the distance, the less fertile the man. So there seems to be strong selection against having a short anogenital distance in men. And once again, the AGD is correlated to CUMD. So remembering that men and women share their developmental and anatomical pathways in the womb, well, you do the math. If this set of inferences were to be supported by further investigations, then we might have a pretty good idea about why women tend not to have short CUMDs that would enable them to have reliable intercourse, orgasm with intercourse. Thus, the female situation might perhaps, we don't know, be a consequence of a balance of selection forces and might be, as we have suggested, primarily a bonus of the male form. So our work leads to future research. The fact that there's no current evidence supporting female orgasms being an adaptation does not mean that it's not one, of course. It's quite possible that it is an adaptation, but the fact remains that at this point there is no evolutionary explanation under which female orgasm is an adaptation that has satisfactory evidence supporting it. While the alternative evolutionary bonus account has amassed more and more evidence each year. Standing back on the large view, this is a story about social, methodological, and theoretical bias affecting science and its reliability and objectivity. Because in order for a scientific community to be truly objective, according to philosopher of science Helen Longino, standards of evidence which are agreed to by all, as a matter of principle, must be enforced and active. These involve shared standards of investigation, methods, and criteria, observational evidence, and reasoning. Otherwise, personal biases, whether unconscious social biases or theoretical and methodological biases regarding when to take no for an answer, for example, and admit alternative evolutionary explanations besides functional ones, may not only influence, but actually determine an investigation, not just for months or for years, but for decades. And in those decades, or even centuries, in the case of Freud, a huge amount of damage can be done in the name of science that is totally unsupported and corrupted by biases that target vulnerable groups, as we saw in androcentric science. We need to be aware that such events can happen, and that science may sometimes, and in some periods, not live up to the legend of objectivity itself. Still, the truly great thing about science is that it can be corrected. That ultimately, and in the long run, evidence must be listened to and reckoned with. And if someone points out that the emperor has no clothes, that there actually is no evidence supporting the functional view, the scientific community can live up to its legend. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Yes, okay.
Hi. I had a question about the rate in which females can get orgasm with intercourse. You said it was actually a very low rate, but if you take the average of this graph, more than half of the cases with an intercourse, a female has an orgasm. So actually the rate is pretty high if you look on the average rate of the whole population.
Well, I'm talking about reliable rates of intercourse. We don't call a car reliable when it doesn't start 10% of the time.
But, I mean, if you look to the graph, like the majority of them was above 50%. So that would be pretty reliable, isn't it?
I don't understand what you're...
No, that's not what the graph.
That's not what the graph says.
It's so the graph showed a line with like the percentage of orgasms with intercourse, and then the percentage of the population having this particular percentage.
Yes, right.
So if you take the average of this graph, then you get like the average percentage of the intercourse that women get an orgasm, and the average of this graph was higher than 50%.
Oh, you mean, on average, does a woman have orgasm with intercourse? Answering the question, on average, does a woman have an orgasm with intercourse? That depends.
Other questions? So about the the male selection model, right? I think one of the premises of this model is that at least at some point in time of human evolution, women, females of the human species, actually copulated serially with different males at the same time. And I mean, except for in porn movies, that's not something that most female humans do these days, right? Can we agree on that? And it is what chimps do, by the way, right? Chimpanzees, that's a common practice among chimpanzees. Is there any evidence at all that these people can provide that at some point in time humans had a behavior similar to chimpanzees?
Well, it's worse than that. The whole female choice account is what's called a sperm competition account. And it's based on the notion that male sperms compete in the female, either in her reproductive tract or across the time of her mating with multiple men. And the person who founded sperm competition theory, Roger Short, denies that sperm competition applies to human beings or to the human lineage. The expert on primates, the world expert on primates, sexuality, Alan Dixon, has an entire segment of his book on why the human lineage and the hominid lineage is not subject to sperm competition and why that involves a mistake. So he rules out of hand old female choice theories on the basis of the fact that they're sperm choice theories. And usually when you have sperm competition, you have one of a number of traits, 10 or 15 traits that you see in the male, like a male baculum of a penis bone and increased size of the sperm, increased sperm motility, fast sperm, hard running sperm, fast sperm, competitive sperm, and so on. And so all these very detailed anatomical changes in the male that go along with sperm competition and human being, and they like to give a list of 10. Also, Richard Wrangham does this at Harvard. They give a list of 10 or 15 of them, none of which humans have. Not one. So I could have made that a short story by telling that.
Yeah, I really wonder why you introduced this intercourse part in the explanation for female orgasm. Because if you are just looking what's the reason for female orgasm, you should look at it without any extra factors. So, and then if you look at the evidence, 96% of the females have orgasm, so that would support.
Well, between 90 and 95, probably. I disagree with that approach, but I'm basically compelled into it because every account, I'm responding to the accounts that are proposed. And there aren't any accounts or numbers that are out there that aren't, besides the masturbation studies that I told you, that are not about orgasm with intercourse. Women have been studied, and their orgasms have been studied almost exclusively with relation to intercourse. That's the only context in which women's orgasm has been interesting. And has been studied. So the only theories that there are theories of women with orgasm, with intercourse. So in my response, I respond to the theories that are there. And that's why I talked about them today. So I think this is a very good question. It really gets at the bias and the heterosexist bias in the work. Very strong heterosexist bias in the work that's there. I think it's a very good question. Thank you.
So usually when you have evolutionary explanations that involve some kind of byproduct, then there are some evolutionary biologists that argue that if a trait that it evolved because of a byproduct and it's costly, then evolution might lead to lose that trait. So for example, in the case of this trait, you might expect that some of the nerves are costly to maintain, and then they might be regulated in such a way that females would lose the capacity to reach an orgasm. So I was wondering if you can comment on why still female orgasm is pervasive and it hasn't been reduced.
That may have been what happened to that 5 to 10% of women who don't have any orgasms. That might be why the 5 to 10% of women who don't have any orgasms, that may explain why they don't have any orgasms, because that method of interference with the trait has occurred. Because it's been too difficult to develop the trait, and they've reached the breaking point, the limit of developmental energy, and they've proved too costly, and the nerve is not developed. The pudendum in these women, some of these women anyway, the pudendal nerve is not developed enough for them to have orgasm. So they may very well be the women that you're talking about.
And maybe they'll think about the future, which is very depressing.
Well, it could be. Yeah, I don't know. Some people say use it or lose it, but that's what the gynecologists say.
Other questions?
Well, I want to come back to the first question. So your worry is that if I'm worried about the women who, I'm worried about the women who I'm talking about the women who reliably have orgasm with intercourse, and you're worried about you're talking about the women who, that the average woman has an orgasm with intercourse.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a uniform distribution between 0 and 100, then the average has to be 50%. And actually the distribution is a little bit skewed to higher percentages, so it's just more than intercourses will not have an orgasm. Take all the room together, and you have to look just purely like what is.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. You didn't understand what I said to you, which is that you don't think your car is reliable if it doesn't start 100% of the time. I'm talking about reliable orgasms.
Then you should, all traits should always be expressed when they have to be adaptive, which is not necessarily the case.
I think we usually think of our vision as being adaptive when it works, yeah?
Yes. But
Okay.
then, so your argument would be that everything that's adaptive have to be expressed in all cases. Well, actually,
I'm not arguing about it being adaptive. I think it's a byproduct.
no, but that's what the argument you use. It's not adaptive because if it's adaptive, it has to be expressed in 100% of the cases.
No, I gave a detailed argument about why it could be spread out all over and still not be adaptive.
No, but the argument that you give that it's not common is not true. It actually happens in more than 50% of the cases of intercourses.
But what exactly happens in more than 50 cases of intercourse? So if you take all
Orgasms.
all the intercourse, and then if you have one woman who has a lot of sex and has, orgasms every time, that was your example there. There's like this one couple, one person producing the...
Most women had orgasms more than 50% of the cases. That was in the graph.
So
Most women had an orgasm more than 50% of the time.
Yes.
That's the data.
That's what
I understand that. Yeah, right. I think that if a car started 50% of the time, you wouldn't call it a reliable car. That's my point.
But what is the
50% or higher?
No, but why does this change? Like, I don't know. I don't understand why this car example. What is the metaphor for this car in that case? So if you say like, it's not a reliable trait if a car doesn't start in 50% of the cases, but if you have an orgasm in 50% of the intercourses, oh,
I'm not going to go around this again with you. I've already given you an answer to this.
no, there was no answer. But anyway, let's keep it like this.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you for your lecture. I'm not sure, but I taste something like a feministic approach in this. That this happened maybe because like a male gaze, only looking at the woman as a breeding machine. But isn't that like just a factor of evolutionary biology? I mean, the only way they study male sex is also by only looking at reproductive and thereby selective factors of the male sexuality. So I would argue that it's not something that has anything to do with the cultural differences per se between men and women, because it's just a factor of evolutionary biology to look at traits in the way, oh, can we maybe pose them in an evolutionary scale?
Oh, of course. Well, the first question always has to be is, does this trait have a function? I mean, yes, of course. So I agree. The evolutionary approach is to look at a trait and assume that for beginning your investigation into the trait that it has a function. Right. So you assume it has a function. But when you get a lot of feedback that it may not have a function from a variety of places, and you have a good alternative that has a lot of data supporting that, and the data supporting the idea that has a function sort of is breaking down, then it's time to move on, is the suggestion.
When you talked about the evolutionary adaptive function of female orgasm, you compared it to the tongue size of the anteater. But when I think of the anteater, the tongue size is something that is pretty straightforward. The bigger, the better, actually. And the tongue eater also lives in an environment where he's constantly confronting with the same adaptation.
Challenge, yeah, right.
But the female orgasm is something that is way more diverse. I mean, in a lot of animals, the female is more like prohibiting sexual acts also, or somebody who is not really encouraging it in order to sleep with everybody. And that's also in humans. So isn't the orgasm something that's logically to evolve not in one direction but in more diversity?
Well, that's the idea behind the female. The male selective picture is addressed to that very drama, actually, of saying sometimes yes, sometimes no to a mate. That is a very important dynamic involved in women's sexuality, and that's absolutely right. The question then becomes: is that a dynamic that is selective on female orgasm? Or is it just a dynamic selective on other aspects of female sexuality, involving her hormonal cycle, involving her choice of mates, or involving her preferences for mates, and so on and so forth? I think there's a lot of interesting research that's done on that variety of subjects. The explanation from that perspective that has been offered for female orgasm, though, are the female choice selection arguments that I just gave. And they're all male sperm selection explanations, which I'm afraid are undermined by everything that we know about the human lineage physiology, according to experts in the human lineage physiology, and according to the guy who invented sperm competition theory. So I take that as relatively authoritative on let's not go that direction any further, because There's no there there. And in addition, the data have so far undermined this account. Yeah, and so the question, there are other aspects of sexuality, but I think orgasm is not one of them that has been shaped by that. But, you know, I think there are other questions. If what we recently discovered about the CUMD distance, the CUMD correlations with orgasm and the CUMD holds up and continues to be correlated with the AGD, which is correlated with, both are correlated with androgen exposure, then the connection between the selection against the short length in males could overcome any selection for the short length in females, right? So even if there were selection on the female orgasm through CUMD, it still couldn't work because the selection is so strong on that, the selection pressure would be too great. So it would be a balancing of selection forces is what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting a black and white picture at all in the end.
Okay, so it's 9:30, so it's time to finish up. But before we thank the speaker, this is a small present that the Studium Generale has kindly offered to you to thank you for your lecture.